The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the Riverside Country Club. But it wasn't the crash that silenced the room, it was what happened next. As 300 wedding guests turned to stare, a woman in a navy suit stepped forward, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe you failed to recognize the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 6 months earlier, I never imagined my wedding day would become a battlefield. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 34 I thought I'd finally found my fairy tale ending with Marcus Hartwell, a successful investment banker from one of Boston's oldest families. What I didn't anticipate was how his family's world would collide with the carefully guarded secret I'd been keeping for years. The trouble started during our engagement party at the Hartwell family estate in Beacon Hill. I should have seen the warning signs then, but love has a way of blinding you to red flags. Marcus's mother, Patricia Hartwell, greeted me with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was everything you'd expect from Boston's old money elite. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, pearls that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a way of speaking that made every question sound like a subtle interrogation. "Sarah, darling," she said, air-kissing both my cheeks. "Marcus tells us you work in government? How quaint." The way she said government made it sound like I collected garbage for a living. I simply smiled and nodded, giving my standard response. "Yes, I work in public service in Washington." It was technically true. I'd been giving versions of this answer for so long that it rolled off my tongue without hesitation. What I didn't mention was that my public service involved making decisions that affected millions of Americans, or that my office was located in the most prestigious building in the legal world. Marcus squeezed my hand supportively. He knew I valued my privacy, though even he didn't know the full extent of what my job entailed. We'd met at a coffee shop near Georgetown University during one of my rare free afternoons, both of us hiding behind sunglasses and casual clothes. He thought I was just another federal employee trying to avoid recognition. In a way, I was. The engagement party continued with Patricia's friends, a collection of society matrons, who seemed to have stepped out of a 1950s etiquette manual, asking increasingly pointed questions about my background. Where did I go to school? Harvard Law. What did my parents do? My father was a mechanic. My mother taught elementary school in Ohio. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees with each honest answer. "How's refreshing," murmured Eleanor Blackwood, Patricia's closest friend and the unofficial gatekeeper of their social circle. "It's so nice when people can rise above their circumstances." I bit my tongue, reminding myself that this was Marcus's family, and I loved him enough to endure their subtle condescension. But as the evening wore on, their comments became less subtle. They spoke about our kind of people and maintaining certain standards with the assumption that I was too naive to understand their meaning. The real drama began when we started planning the wedding. Patricia insisted on handling most of the arrangements, claiming it was tradition for the groom's family to host the reception. I was grateful for the help until I realized her version of help meant making every decision without consulting me. "I've booked the Riverside Country Club," she announced during one of our planning meetings. "It's where all the Hartwell weddings have been held. The guest list is already prepared, 300 of our closest friends and family." I looked at the list she handed me. I recognized maybe 20 names, and half of those were Marcus's college friends. "What about my guests?" I asked. Patricia waved dismissively. "Oh, I'm sure we can squeeze in a few of your people, though we'll need to be selective. The club has certain standards about membership." My people included some of the most influential figures in American politics and law, but I couldn't exactly explain that without revealing my identity. So I submitted a modest list of 20 guests, including my parents, my law school roommate Jennifer, and a few carefully chosen colleagues who could blend in without drawing attention to my real job. The dress shopping expedition was where Patricia's mask truly slipped. She'd insisted on accompanying me to an exclusive boutique on Newbury Street, bringing along Eleanor and 2 other members of her inner circle. I'd already found a dress I loved, an elegant but understated A-line gown with delicate lace sleeves. It was beautiful without being ostentatious, exactly what I wanted for my wedding day. "Oh no, dear," Patricia said, shaking her head. "That's far too simple for a Hartwell wedding. You need something with more presence. She proceeded to select a series of increasingly elaborate gowns, each more expensive and ornate than the last. Ball gowns with cathedral trains, dresses dripping with crystals and beading, designs that look like they belonged in a royal palace rather than a country club. When I politely declined each suggestion, her frustration became palpable. "Sarah," she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd grown to despise, "I understand that you're not familiar with these social expectations, but appearances matter in our circle. People will be watching, judging. We can't have the bride looking like she bought her dress off the rack at a department store." The boutique staff exchanged uncomfortable glances. I could feel my cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger, but I maintained my composure. "I appreciate your concern, Patricia, but I'm comfortable with my choice." Eleanor leaned in conspiratorially. "Perhaps we could arrange for some assistance with the cost. I'm sure Patricia would be happy to help with something more appropriate." The implication was clear. They thought I couldn't afford a proper wedding dress. They assumed that my government job barely paid enough to cover basic expenses, let alone a designer gown. If only they knew that I could have bought every dress in the boutique without making a dent in my bank account. But their assumptions went deeper than money. Over the following weeks, their comments revealed a fundamental belief that I was beneath their social class, that I was marrying up and should be grateful for their acceptance. They spoke about training me in proper etiquette, introducing me to the right people, and helping me adjust to their lifestyle. The breaking point came during the rehearsal dinner. Patricia had organized an intimate gathering of 50 people at a private dining room in one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants. I sat at the head table, watching as she worked the room like a seasoned politician, making sure every guest understood the family's position on various social and political issues. When the conversation turned to recent Supreme Court decisions, I found myself in an impossible position. Several guests were discussing cases I'd personally heard arguments for, offering opinions about rulings I'd helped craft. I sat silently, sipping my wine and nodding politely, while they debated the competence and qualifications of justices they'd never met. "The problem with the current court," declared Richard Pemberton, a corporate lawyer and family friend, "is that they're appointing people based on politics rather than merit. Half of them probably couldn't handle a complex case if their lives depended on it." Eleanor nodded sagely. "It's what happens when you lower standards. They're more concerned with checking boxes than finding truly qualified candidates." I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to collect myself. In the mirror, I saw a woman caught between two worlds: the private citizen who'd fallen in love with a kind man, and the public figure whose very existence challenged everything his family believed about merit, qualifications, and worth. Jennifer found me there, having followed me from the dining room. "You okay?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just wedding jitters." She gave me a look that said she wasn't buying it. Jennifer was one of the few people who knew my real identity, and she'd been watching the evening's events with growing concern. "Sarah, you don't have to put up with this. You know that, right?" I did know it. I also knew that tomorrow was my wedding day, and I was marrying Marcus, not his family. I could endure their condescension for one more day if it meant starting my life with the man I loved. But as I returned to the dining room and took my seat beside Marcus, listening to his family and friends continue their commentary about people like me, I wondered if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. The weight of my secret felt heavier than ever, and for the first time, I began to understand that some revelations, once made, could never be taken back. Tomorrow would change everything. I just didn't know how much. The morning of my wedding dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I woke up in the bridal suite at the Four Seasons, surrounded by white roses and champagne I had no appetite for. My parents had arrived the night before, and seeing them in this opulent setting made the contrast between my two worlds even sharper. My father, Tom Mitchell, looked uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo as he fidgeted with his bow tie. "You sure about this, kiddo?" he asked, using the nickname he'd called me since childhood. "These people, they don't seem like your crowd." My mother Linda shot him a warning look while adjusting the pearl necklace I'd given her for the occasion. "Tom, it's her wedding day. Be supportive." But I could see the concern in her eyes too. My parents had worked 3 jobs between them to put me through college and law school. They understood the value of hard work and merit in ways the Hartwells never could. Watching Patricia dismiss them at the rehearsal dinner with barely concealed disdain had been one of the hardest moments of the entire engagement. Jennifer arrived with my team of stylists, her expression carefully neutral. As my maid of honor, she'd been trying to stay positive, but I could tell she was struggling with the family dynamics as much as I was. "Your hair looks beautiful," she said, as the stylist put the finishing touches on my updo. "Very elegant." The woman in the mirror looked like a stranger. The hairstylist had created something elaborate and formal, nothing like my usual professional but understated style. The makeup artist had applied more foundation and contouring than I'd worn in my entire adult life. Even my nails, painted a shade of pale pink I'd never have chosen, felt foreign. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "Patricia sent this over," Jennifer said hesitantly, holding up a diamond tiara that probably cost more than most people's houses. "She said it's a family heirloom, worn by Hartwell brides for generations." I stared at the ostentatious piece, its diamonds catching the light like tiny spotlights. It was beautiful, undoubtedly, but it wasn't me. Nothing about this day felt like me anymore. "I think I'll stick with the simple veil," I said quietly. Jennifer nodded approvingly and tucked the tiara back into its velvet box. "Good choice. You look perfect as you are." The dress fitting had been scheduled for one final adjustment, and when the seamstress arrived, she brought unexpected company. Patricia swept into the suite with Eleanor and two other society matrons in tow, apparently deciding this was the perfect time for a final inspection. "Oh good, you're almost ready," Patricia said, circling me like a predator evaluating prey. "Though I do think the tiara would complete the look beautifully." "I prefer the veil," I replied firmly. Eleanor made a disapproving noise. "Such a shame. The tiara has been in Marcus's family for over a century. It would be appropriate for you to honor that tradition." The subtext was clear. As someone marrying into their family, I should be grateful to wear their heirlooms regardless of my own preferences. The other women nodded in agreement, creating a united front of disapproval. "The veil is lovely," my mother interjected diplomatically, but I could see the steel in her eyes. Linda Mitchell might teach third grade for a living, but she'd raised a daughter who'd reached the highest levels of American government, and she wasn't about to let anyone diminish that achievement, even unknowingly. Patricia's smile tightened. "Of course, Mrs. Mitchell, I'm sure you have different traditions in Ohio." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. Jennifer stepped closer to me, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I think Sarah should wear whatever makes her feel most beautiful on her wedding day," Jennifer said diplomatically. "Naturally," Eleanor replied, though her tone suggested anything but agreement. "Though one does hope she understands the significance of joining such an established family, there are expectations, standards to maintain." I felt something snap inside me. For months I'd endured their subtle insults and patronizing comments, biting my tongue for Marcus's sake. But standing there in my wedding dress, surrounded by people who saw me as nothing more than an outsider trying to climb the social ladder, I reached my breaking point. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice calm, but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room straighten slightly. "I understand that you've made assumptions about who I am and what I'm worth based on limited information. I understand that you believe I should be grateful to be accepted into your circle. And I understand that you think my background somehow makes me less qualified to be part of this family." The room fell silent. Patricia's carefully composed expression flickered with surprise and what might have been alarm. "Sarah, dear," she began. But I wasn't finished. "What you don't understand," I continued, "is that respect isn't inherited through bloodlines or bank accounts. It's earned through character, integrity, and how you treat other people. And frankly, based on what I've observed over the past 6 months, I'm not sure who should be grateful to whom in this arrangement." Eleanor gasped audibly. The other society matrons exchanged shocked glances. No one had ever spoken to Patricia Hartwell like that, certainly not someone they considered beneath their social station. Patricia's composure cracked completely. "How dare you speak to me that way? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Who are we?" "Yes," I replied evenly. I know exactly who you are. The question is whether you have any idea who I am. Before Patricia could respond, there was a knock at the door. My security detail, 3 discreet individuals I'd introduced as wedding coordinators, entered with apologetic expressions. Ma'am, the lead agent said quietly, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Jennifer moved quickly to block the other women's view as the agent approached me with a secure phone. I listened to the brief conversation, my expression growing serious. How urgent? I asked. Emergency session, ma'am. They need your input within the hour. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders like a familiar cloak. Even on my wedding day, the demands of my real job couldn't be completely set aside. Give me 10 minutes, I said. As the agent stepped back, I became aware that Patricia and her friends were staring at me with confused expressions. They'd clearly never seen wedding coordinators, who carried government-issued phones and called anyone ma'am, with that particular tone of respect. Is everything all right? My mother asked, though her expression suggested she already knew this was related to my work. Just a small emergency, I said carefully. Nothing that can't be handled quickly. I moved to the private adjoining room, where I could take the secure call in privacy. For 15 minutes, I discussed constitutional precedent and judicial procedure with my clerks and fellow justices, my mind switching seamlessly from wedding logistics to matters of national importance. When I returned to the main suite, the atmosphere had shifted. Patricia and her entourage were whispering among themselves, clearly disturbed by what they'd witnessed, but unable to piece together its significance. Shall we head to the church? I asked, as if nothing unusual had happened. The drive to the ceremony was tense. Patricia kept glancing at me with a mixture of suspicion and uncertainty, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Eleanor asked pointed questions about my wedding coordinators that I deflected with practiced ease. But I could feel something building, a pressure that had been mounting for months and was now approaching a breaking point. The woman who'd spent years making decisions that shaped American law wasn't going to stay silent much longer, regardless of the consequences. As we pulled up to the church, I caught sight of Marcus waiting at the altar through the stained glass windows. For a moment, my resolve wavered. I loved him genuinely, completely. But love, I was beginning to realize, might not be enough to bridge the gap between who his family thought I was and who I really am. The processional music began, and I took my father's arm. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of orchestrated perfection. Mark's Episcopal Church was everything Patricia had envisioned: towering Gothic arches, stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the marble floor, and enough flowers to stock a small florist shop. 300 guests filled the pews, their whispered conversations creating a subtle buzz of anticipation. As I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, I caught glimpses of familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. My law school professors, a few carefully selected colleagues, my childhood neighbors from Ohio, all looking slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding them. They sat in stark contrast to the Hartwell contingent, who occupied the front rows like royalty holding court. Marcus looked breathtakingly handsome in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his face lighting up when he saw me approaching. For a moment, all the tension and conflict of the past months faded away. This was why I was here. For him, for us, for the love we'd built despite the chaos surrounding it. The vows we'd written were personal and heartfelt, speaking to the quiet moments we'd shared away from his family's scrutiny. When Marcus promised to love me exactly as you are, for who you are, I felt tears prick my eyes. He meant it, even if he didn't fully understand the weight of those words. But even during the ceremony, I could feel the undercurrent of judgment from the Hartwell side of the church. Subtle eye rolls during my vows, whispered comments about my dress, dismissive glances toward my family and friends. They were treating my wedding like a performance they were being forced to endure, rather than a celebration they were honored to witness. The real trouble began at the reception. The Riverside Country Club had been transformed into Patricia's vision of wedding perfection: crystal chandeliers, white roses everywhere, and a string quartet playing classical pieces that somehow managed to sound stuffy rather than elegant. The head table was positioned like a throne room, with the wedding party elevated above the other guests. During cocktail hour, I watched the clear social divisions play out in real time. My guests clustered together near the bar, making polite conversation with Marcus's college friends who were kind enough to bridge the gap. Meanwhile, the Hartwell inner circle held court near the windows overlooking the golf course, their laughter carrying a sharp edge that suggested they were discussing more than just the weather. I was trapped in receiving line hell, shaking hands with an endless stream of people whose names I'd never remember, and who looked at me like I was an interesting specimen in a museum. The comments ranged from backhanded compliments to outright condescension, all delivered with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Such a lovely ceremony," said one elderly woman whose jewelry could have funded a small country. "So refreshing to see Marcus choose someone so different from his usual type." "Different, how?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Oh, you know?" she replied, with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Someone more grounded, less privileged. It shows such character that he's willing to look beyond social status." I smiled politely and moved on to the next guest, but each interaction felt like a small cut. They spoke about me as if I were a charity case Marcus had rescued, a project he'd taken on to prove his magnanimous nature. The situation deteriorated further during dinner. I'd been placed at the head table between Marcus and his best man, facing the entire reception. It felt like being on display, every gesture and expression scrutinized by 300 pairs of eyes. The trouble started when the conversation at our table turned to current events. Richard Pemberton, who'd attended law school with Marcus's father, launched into a critique of recent Supreme Court decisions with the confidence of someone who'd never actually practiced constitutional law. "The problem with the current court," he declared loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear, "is that they're more concerned with making political statements than following legal precedent. Half of these justices couldn't argue their way out of a paper bag." Several people nodded in agreement. Eleanor chimed in from the next table. "It's what happens when you prioritize diversity over qualifications. They're appointing people based on checking boxes rather than actual merit." I felt Marcus tense beside me. He knew I worked in the legal field and could sense my discomfort, though he attributed it to the general awkwardness of the evening rather than the personal attack I was experiencing. "Don't you think that's a bit unfair?" Jennifer interjected from across the table. "The current justices all have exceptional credentials and decades of experience." Patricia laughed dismissively. "Oh please, compare their backgrounds to justices from previous generations. The standards have clearly declined. These days they'll appoint anyone with the right political connections, regardless of whether they're actually qualified for the position." The irony was almost unbearable. I was sitting 3 feet away from her, listening to her question the qualifications of people like me while she planned to spend the rest of the evening. Me like an intellectual inferior who'd somehow tricked her son into marriage. "What do you think, Sarah?" Eleanor asked with fake sweetness, clearly expecting me to fumble through some uninformed opinion that would confirm their assumptions about my intelligence. "You work in the government, don't you? Surely you have thoughts about the competence of our current judicial system." The table fell silent. All eyes turned to me, waiting for me to reveal my ignorance and validate their prejudices. Marcus squeezed my hand supportively, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He knew I was capable of holding my own in any intellectual discussion, but he also knew his family was looking for any excuse to dismiss me. I took a sip of champagne, buying myself a moment to consider my response. I could give them the safe, non-committal answer they expected. I could deflect with humor or change the subject entirely. Or I could tell them exactly what I thought about their assumptions regarding merit, qualifications, and who deserved to hold positions of power in American society. "I think," I said carefully, "that competence and qualifications are often judged by different standards depending on who's doing the judging. Sometimes people mistake familiarity for excellence, or assume that because someone comes from a certain background, they must be more capable than someone who doesn't." Patricia's expression sharpened. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "I mean that true qualifications, intelligence, integrity, judgment, dedication to justice, aren't determined by family connections or social status. The best judges are often those who've had to work hardest to prove themselves, who understand what it means to face real challenges and overcome them through merit alone." The temperature at the table seemed to drop several degrees. Several guests at nearby tables had stopped their own conversations to listen to ours. "How convenient," Eleanor said with a brittle smile, that you define qualifications in a way that elevates your own background while diminishing the value of tradition and established excellence. I'm simply suggesting, I replied evenly, that perhaps we should judge people by their actual achievements, rather than our assumptions about what those achievements should look like. Richard leaned forward aggressively. And what achievements would those be, exactly? What have you accomplished that gives you the authority to lecture us about judicial qualifications? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the table, faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. This was their moment, the chance to expose what they saw as my pretensions, and put me firmly in what they considered my proper place. Marcus started to intervene, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him. For months I'd been allowing these people to define me by their assumptions and limitations. I'd stayed silent while they questioned my worth, my intelligence, my right to be part of their world. But as I looked around the table at their expectant faces, I realized that my silence had only emboldened their disrespect. They'd mistaken my discretion for weakness, my humility for inadequacy. They genuinely believed they were superior to me in every measurable way. It was time to set the record straight. You really want to know? I asked quietly. The entire head table leaned forward slightly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even the string quartet seemed to pause between songs, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what came next. You really want to know? I repeated, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet reception hall. Before anyone could respond, I felt a familiar presence behind me. Agent Catherine Walsh, my head of security, appeared at my shoulder with the kind of professional urgency that made everyone at the table straighten unconsciously. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "we have a situation developing. The Attorney General is on line 1, and there's been an emergency filing that requires your immediate review." The effect was instantaneous. Conversations at nearby tables faltered as people registered the peculiar exchange. Government officials didn't typically interrupt wedding receptions, and they certainly didn't address brides as ma'am with that particular tone of deference. Patricia's face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, suspicion, and growing alarm. "Excuse me," she said sharply, "but who exactly are you people?" Agent Walsh turned to her with the kind of professional courtesy that somehow managed to be both respectful and dismissive. "Ma'am, I'm with the United States Marshals Service. We provide security details for certain high-ranking federal officials." The words hit the table like a bomb going off in slow motion. Eleanor's champagne glass slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Richard's mouth fell open in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. The color drained from Patricia's face so quickly, I thought she might faint. "Security detail?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, what's going on?" I looked around the table at the faces staring back at me, some confused, some beginning to show dawning comprehension, all completely stunned. After months of enduring their condescension and assumptions, this moment felt both terrifying and liberating. "I'm sorry," I said to Agent Walsh, "but could you give me just a few more minutes?" I believe I was in the middle of answering a question about my qualifications. The agent nodded and stepped back slightly, but remained close enough to intervene if necessary. Her presence had transformed the entire dynamic of the reception. People at distant tables were craning their necks to see what was happening, and the string quartet had stopped playing entirely. I turned back to Richard, who was staring at me like I'd suddenly sprouted a second head. "You asked about my achievements," I said calmly. "Where would you like me to start?"
I what?
"Who are you?" he stammered. "I'm exactly who I've always told you I was," I replied. "I work in public service in Washington. I graduated from Harvard Law School. I've dedicated my career to upholding justice and the rule of law. The difference is that you assumed those facts made me less qualified than you, rather than more." Patricia found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "What kind of public service?" I glanced at Marcus, whose expression was cycling through confusion, realization, and something that might have been awe. "I'm the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court." The silence that followed was deafening. Someone at a nearby table dropped their fork, the clatter echoing through the vast reception hall like a gunshot. Eleanor made a small whimpering sound. Richard looked like he was going to be sick. "That's impossible," Patricia whispered. You're just what? I asked gently. Just a mechanic's daughter from Ohio? Just someone who doesn't know which fork to use for the salad course? Just a person who had the audacity to marry your son without proper social credentials? Marcus reached for my hand, his eyes wide with understanding. Sarah, the calls, the security detail, the way you sometimes disappear for hours. Oh my God. I squeezed his hand reassuringly. I wanted to tell you everything, but my position requires a certain level of discretion, especially during confirmation hearings and sensitive cases. Confirmation hearings, Eleanor's voice was barely audible. Yes, I said, turning to address the growing crowd of onlookers who had abandoned their own tables to witness the drama unfolding. 3 years ago, I was confirmed as the youngest Chief Justice in American history. The vote was unanimous, something that hadn't happened in decades. Agent Walsh stepped forward again, this time holding a secure phone. Ma'am, the Attorney General is holding, and Justice Thompson needs to conference with you about the emergency injunction. I nodded and took the phone, stepping slightly away from the table for privacy. For 5 minutes, I discussed constitutional precedent and emergency judicial procedures while 300 wedding guests watched in stunned silence. When I finished the call and handed the phone back to my security detail, the transformation in the room was palpable. People were no longer looking at me like I was an oddity who'd somehow infiltrated their exclusive world. They were looking at me like I was one of the most powerful people in the country, which constitutionally speaking I was. I don't understand, Patricia said, weakly. If what you're saying is true, why didn't you tell us? I sat back down beside Marcus, who was still processing the revelation with shell-shocked amazement. Because I wanted you to know me as a person first. I wanted Marcus to fall in love with Sarah Mitchell, not with a title or position. And honestly, I was curious to see how you'd treat someone you thought was beneath your social status. The implications of that statement rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Months of condescending comments, patronizing advice, and subtle insults were suddenly recontextualized. They hadn't been educating a naive government clerk, they'd been lecturing one of the most qualified legal minds in the country. But you let us, Eleanor started, then stopped, apparently unable to finish the sentence.
Let you what?
Assume I was ignorant, treat me like I was lucky to be accepted into your circle, make jokes about diversity appointments and lowered standards while I sat right in front of you. My voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath.
Yes, I let you do all of that.
Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought there were no consequences for your behavior. Richard had recovered enough to attempt damage control, though his voice was shaky. We never meant, that is, we were just making conversation about general political issues. We had no idea that you were insulting me personally. I finished. That when you questioned the qualifications of Supreme Court justices, you were questioning my qualifications. That when you suggested diversity appointments were about checking boxes rather than merit, you were saying I didn't deserve my position. Marcus finally spoke, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and mortification. Sarah, I'm so sorry, I had no idea they were. God, they must have sounded like such idiots. They sounded like people who had never been challenged on their assumptions, I said diplomatically. People who confuse privilege with merit and familiarity with competence. Agent Walsh approached again, this time accompanied by 2 additional security personnel I hadn't seen before. Ma'am, we've received word that media outlets have gotten wind of your location. We should consider moving to a more secure venue if you plan to continue the reception. The mention of media attention sent another wave of shock through the crowd. Several guests immediately pulled out their phones, presumably to Google my name and confirm what they'd just witnessed. Others looked around nervously, as if reporters might burst through the doors at any moment. Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. This is a disaster. People will talk, they'll say we didn't know, that we weren't informed of the proper protocols. What protocols would those be? I asked curiously. For entertaining someone of your status, she said, clearly struggling with the new reality. The seating arrangements, the security considerations, the guest list approvals. I almost laughed. Even now, faced with irrefutable evidence of her misjudgment, Patricia was more concerned with social protocol than personal reflection. There are no special protocols for my personal life. I'm still the same person I was an hour ago. The only thing that's changed is your perception of who that person is. Marcus squeezed my hand tighter. Are you really? Are you still going to be the same Sarah who falls asleep reading legal briefs and makes terrible coffee? For the first time since the revelation began, I smiled genuinely. I'll still make terrible coffee. Though the legal briefs I fall asleep reading might be slightly more consequential than you realized. The reception hall buzzed with the kind of energy that comes from witnessing something unprecedented. But as I looked around at the faces surrounding me, some awed, some embarrassed, some still processing the magnitude of what had just happened, I realized that the most important reaction was the one sitting right beside me. Marcus was looking at me with wonder, pride, and something deeper that made my heart race. "My wife," he said softly, "the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court." The words hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of revelation and the promise of a future where there would be no more secrets, no more assumptions, and hopefully, no more underestimation of what people were capable of achieving. The aftermath of my revelation unfolded like ripples spreading across a pond. Within minutes, the news had traveled to every corner of the reception hall. Guests who had been making small talk about golf handicaps and summer vacation plans were now frantically Googling my name, their phones illuminating faces frozen in disbelief. I watched the social dynamic shift in real time. People who had barely acknowledged my parents earlier in the evening were now approaching them with newfound respect, eager to introduce themselves to the family of the Chief Justice. My father, still uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo, handled the attention with bemused grace. "Proud of our Sarah," he told anyone who would listen, his Ohio accent cutting through the cultured Boston vowels surrounding him. "Always knew she was destined for something special, even when she was knee-deep in law books at the kitchen table." My mother, more diplomatic but equally proud, found herself surrounded by women who suddenly wanted to know everything about raising such an accomplished daughter. The same people who had dismissed her as a simple schoolteacher were now hanging on her every word about work-life balance and supporting ambitious children. Meanwhile, Marcus and I found ourselves in the eye of the storm. He hadn't let go of my hand since the revelation, as if he needed physical confirmation that I was real, that this was actually happening. "How long have you been?" he started, then shook his head. "3 years, you said. We've been together for 8 months. That means for most of our relationship, you've been dating the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court without knowing it." I finished. "Are you okay with that?" He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Okay with it?" "Sarah, I'm married to the most powerful woman in the American legal system. I'm terrified, amazed, and incredibly proud all at the same time." Our moment was interrupted by the arrival of someone I hadn't expected to see at the reception. Ambassador Helen Crawford, my former mentor and longtime family friend, made her way through the crowd with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she was on a mission. Patricia, who was still processing the evening's revelations while trying to maintain some semblance of hostess dignity, intercepted the ambassador near our table. "Excuse me, but I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Patricia Hartwell, mother of the groom." Ambassador Crawford smiled with the kind of diplomatic warmth that could either signal genuine friendship or polite tolerance. "Ambassador Helen Crawford, United States Mission to the United Nations. I'm here for Sarah." The title hit Patricia like a physical blow. Not only had she spent months condescending to the Chief Justice, but now she was face to face with one of America's most senior diplomatic officials. The ambassador's presence added another layer of legitimacy to my position that even Patricia's considerable capacity for denial couldn't dismiss. "Ambassador Crawford," I said, standing to greet her. "I didn't know you were in Boston." "I flew up as soon as I heard the news," she replied, embracing me warmly. "I couldn't miss celebrating with my favorite former clerk. Though I have to say, your security team wasn't thrilled about the media attention this is generating." As if summoned by her words, Agent Walsh appeared at my elbow again. "Ma'am, we have news vans setting up outside. CNN, Fox News, and the local affiliates are all requesting statements. The White House Communications Office is asking about your availability for a briefing call." The mention of the White House sent another wave of shocked murmurs through the crowd. Several guests had their phones out now, not just to research me but to take pictures and videos of what was clearly becoming a historic moment. Marcus squeezed my hand tighter. "Is this what our life is going to be like? Media attention and security protocols and emergency calls during dinner?" I considered his question carefully. It was fair, and he deserved an honest answer. Sometimes, yes. The position comes with responsibilities that don't pause for personal events. But it also comes with the opportunity to shape American law for generations. To protect constitutional rights and ensure justice for millions of people. The cases you can't discuss, he said, understanding dawning in his eyes. The times you disappear for hours without explanation, the secure phone calls. All of it, I confirmed. Every evasive answer, every I can't talk about work response. It was all protecting classified information and ongoing cases. Ambassador Crawford watched our exchange with interest before turning to address the growing crowd around us. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her diplomatic training allowing her voice to carry without seeming to shout, "I believe you've all just witnessed something quite remarkable. Not just the revelation of Chief Justice Mitchell's identity, but a demonstration of her character." The reception hall quieted as people strained to hear her words. "For months, apparently, you've all had the privilege of knowing one of America's most distinguished jurists without the barriers that usually accompany such positions. You've seen her as she truly is, not as a title or an office, but as a person. That's a gift few people in her position can offer." Eleanor, who had been conspicuously silent since my revelation, finally found her voice. "We had no idea," she said, weakly. "If we had known, you would have treated me differently," I finished. "You would have been deferential instead of dismissive, respectful instead of condescending. But that's exactly why I didn't tell you. I wanted to see who you really were when you thought there were no consequences for your behavior." The ambassador nodded approvingly, character revealed under pressure. "It's one of the most reliable measures of a person's true nature." Patricia, who had been growing increasingly pale throughout the evening, finally spoke up. "Chief Justice Mitchell," she began formally, then stopped, and started again. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. We all do. Our behavior was inexcusable. Was it?" I asked gently. "Or was it simply honest? You treated me exactly as you treat anyone you perceive as socially inferior. The problem isn't that you were dishonest. It's that your honesty revealed beliefs about worth and merit that are fundamentally flawed." Richard, who had been mostly silent since the revelation, cleared his throat nervously. "The things we said about the court, about qualifications and standards, were your genuine opinions," I said. "Opinions based on assumptions about what qualifications look like, what merit means, and who deserves to hold positions of power. The fact that you were wrong about me specifically doesn't change the underlying prejudices that shaped those opinions." The ambassador watched this exchange with the keen interest of someone who had spent decades navigating complex political and social situations. "This," she said to the crowd, "is why Chief Justice Mitchell is so exceptional at her job. She doesn't just interpret the law, she understands the human dynamics that shape how justice is administered." Agent Walsh stepped forward once more, this time with greater urgency. "Ma'am, the media presence is growing significantly. We really should consider relocating if you want to continue the reception privately." I looked around at the faces surrounding me, some awed, some embarrassed, some still processing the magnitude of what had transpired. Then I looked at Marcus, whose expression had settled into something that looked like wonder mixed with fierce pride. "What do you think?" I asked him, ready to face the world as the husband of a sitting Chief Justice. He stood up, still holding my hand, and addressed the crowd. "I think," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "that I'm the luckiest man in America. Not because I married someone with an impressive title, but because I married someone with the character to earn that title, and the integrity to never use it for personal advantage." The reception hall erupted in applause, genuine this time, not the polite social clapping that had marked the earlier toasts. People were applauding, not just for the revelation, but for the courage it had taken to live authentically, despite the social pressures surrounding us. As the applause died down, I realized that the champagne flute I'd dropped at the beginning of this story had been prophetic. That moment of clumsiness had marked the end of one phase of my life and the beginning of another. No more secrets, no more careful evasions, no more pretending to be less than I was for the comfort of others. The woman who walked out of that reception hall, hand in hand with her new husband, was no longer hiding behind assumptions and expectations. She was exactly who she had always been. Sarah Mitchell, daughter of a mechanic and a teacher, Harvard Law graduate, and Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And she was done apologizing for any of it. 6 months later, I stood in the marble corridors of the Supreme Court building, adjusting my judicial robes before heading into oral arguments. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting familiar shadows across the floor I'd walked countless times. But something felt different now, lighter, somehow. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Good luck with the healthcare case today. Remember, you're brilliant and I love you. P.S. Mom wants to know if you're free for dinner Sunday. She's making that roast you liked." I smiled, remembering the dramatic transformation in our family dynamics. The wedding reception revelation had fundamentally changed how the Hartwells viewed not just me, but their own assumptions about worth and achievement. Patricia had spent weeks afterward reaching out to my parents, genuinely interested in understanding how they'd raised someone who reached such heights. The dinner invitation was part of a new tradition. Every few weeks, Patricia would host family meals where she actually listened instead of lecturing. She'd asked my mother for parenting advice, consulted my father about his perspective on American politics, and even started volunteering with literacy programs in underserved communities, something she claimed was inspired by my background. Eleanor had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation. She'd written me a formal letter of apology, then followed it up by endowing a scholarship fund at Harvard Law School specifically for first-generation college students from working-class families. When I'd asked her why, she'd simply said, "Because I realized how many brilliant minds I've probably dismissed over the years based on their zip codes." But the most significant change had been in my own life. No more careful evasions about my work, no more downplaying my achievements for others' comfort. When legal scholars wanted to interview me, I said yes. When law schools invited me to speak, I accepted. When young women wrote asking for career advice, I responded personally. My chamber door opened, and Justice Thompson poked his head in. "Ready for the big day, Chief?" Today's case was particularly significant, a constitutional challenge that would shape healthcare access for millions. The kind of case that reminded me why I'd chosen law in the first place, why every difficult moment of my career had been worth it. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, gathering my notes. Walking into the courtroom, I caught sight of the public gallery. Marcus was there, as he was for every major case, sitting next to my parents who'd driven down from Ohio. They never missed an opportunity to watch their daughter in action, still somewhat amazed that the little girl who'd studied by lamplight at their kitchen table was now one of the most powerful people in the country. But what struck me most was seeing Patricia in the gallery as well. She'd started attending my oral arguments, claiming she was educating herself about constitutional law. I suspected it was more about understanding the woman she'd so thoroughly misjudged, but I appreciated the effort regardless. As I took my seat at the center of the bench, looking out at the packed courtroom, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Not just the years of education and hard work, but the more recent journey of learning to live authentically despite others' expectations. The wedding revelation had taught me something crucial: hiding your light doesn't make others more comfortable, it just enables their prejudices. By allowing the Hartwells to underestimate me, I'd inadvertently validated their belief that worth could be determined by superficial markers like accent, background, or social connections. "All rise," the court crier announced. "The Honorable the Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States." As we filed into the courtroom, I felt the weight of responsibility that came with this position. Every decision we made would affect real people living real lives. The constitutional principles we upheld or struck down would shape American society for generations. The attorney presenting the opening argument was a young woman, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of nervous energy I remembered from my own early court appearances. She was brilliant. Her brief had been masterful, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she approached the podium. During her presentation, I noticed something interesting happening in the gallery. Patricia was taking notes, actually engaged with the complex constitutional arguments being presented. 6 months ago, she would have dismissed this attorney as another diversity hire, without bothering to listen to her legal reasoning. Now she was learning. The case proceeded with the usual rigorous questioning from the bench. Justice Williams challenged the government's position on federal authority. Justice Chen pressed for clarification on state sovereignty issues. Justice Rodriguez explored the implications for individual rights. When it was my turn to question the attorneys, I felt the familiar surge of intellectual engagement that had drawn me to law in the first place. This was what I'd trained for, what I'd sacrificed for, the opportunity to grapple with the most complex legal questions facing our democracy. After oral arguments concluded, I returned to my chambers to begin the difficult work of crafting an opinion that would stand the test of time. My clerks had prepared extensive research, but the final decision would be mine to make. As I worked late into the evening, I received a call from an unexpected source. A young law student from a small town in Alabama, the daughter of a single mother who cleaned office buildings to pay for her education. She'd seen news coverage of my wedding story and wanted to thank me for showing that someone like her could aspire to the highest levels of the legal profession. I used to think the Supreme Court was only for people from fancy families and elite schools, she said. But seeing your story, knowing that you came from a working-class family in Ohio, it makes me believe that maybe I could make it too. That phone call reminded me why the wedding revelation had been necessary, despite its personal cost. Representation matters not just in terms of who holds positions of power, but in terms of who believes they can achieve those positions. By hiding my background, I'd been inadvertently perpetuating the myth that success belonged only to certain types of people. Marcus picked me up from the court that evening, as he often did when I worked late. During the drive home, he told me about his day, a normal day of investment meetings and client calls, blissfully free of constitutional crises and media attention. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked as we sat in traffic, the simplicity of our relationship before everyone knew who I was. He considered this seriously, as he did most questions. "Sometimes I miss the anonymity, but I don't miss watching you diminish yourself for other people's comfort. You're magnificent, Sarah. The whole world should know it." That night, as I fell asleep next to my husband in our Georgetown townhouse, I reflected on how much had changed since that dramatic wedding reception. The revelation had cost me some relationships. A few of Marcus's friends had distanced themselves, apparently uncomfortable with the new dynamic. But it had also freed me to be fully myself in ways I hadn't realized I'd been suppressing. The little girl from Ohio who dreamed of being a lawyer while doing homework at her parents' kitchen table had not only achieved that dream but had claimed it proudly, without apology or diminishment. She'd learned that true acceptance meant being valued for who you really are, not for who others assume you to be. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be smaller than you are, no matter how much more comfortable it might make everyone else. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.